In 1790, the rabbi of the Newport Synagogue wrote a letter to General Washington. This is only 14 years after the War of Independence, and he wrote to General Washington thanking him for the great victory that America had just had in coming into existence. And in his letter, he said essentially that he hoped that the people of that all nations, including the people of Abraham, would be, quote, generously afforded all liberty of conscience and immunity of citizenship, deeming everyone of whatever nation, tongue, or language equal parts of this great governmental machine. He was asking to be treated equally as all other citizens. And he used the word generously as if it is some gift that the people of America would give the Jewish people. That's interesting of itself, but what's more interesting was the response of General Washington, where he answered back with almost the exact same words. He said it was by that essentially that the Jews, all nations, will have all the rights, and he quoted back the exact words of Rabbi Sextus, except instead of using the word generously afforded, he said that it is the exercise of their inherent natural right. Namely, this is not a gift given to the Jewish people by the people of America. This is a natural right of the Jewish people being part of America. So I raise this because what you see is that the idea of America has been fundamentally linked since its beginning. And there are equal sorts of examples even before America was created in the American colonies of how intertwined the story of American Jews were with the story of America itself. So when I would go to the Holocaust Museum and people would ask me, do you think a Holocaust could happen in America? Growing up in America, my answer was it's impossible. It cannot happen in America. And the truth is it cannot happen in America as long as America is America, because of this deep connection between the Jewish people and the American idea. It's further based in the sort of religious foundations of America, even when secularized, that the idea of Mount Moriah, the idea of individual rights are based on human life being derived from God, not from other men, and therefore your right is not revocable by men. This is all from the Bible. This is all part of America's idea of being the New Jerusalem. So I raise all this because basically the American idea and the idea of freedom for the Jews and treatment of the Jews is so intertwined. And it came to the point eventually in the letter of George Washington that said, essentially, America will be judged ultimately by how it treats its Jews, and that, quote, they will enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, and everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. That's the idea of America. And that's why you had this 300-year experience of Jews in America that has been so wonderful, a utopia of sorts, the best experience essentially the Jewish people had in the diaspora for 2,000 years until Israel was created. And now Jews are afraid. Now Jews fear for their lives in America. Jewish children are not going back to their universities because they're afraid of what they may encounter. Jews wind up fleeing into libraries with mobs outside. Everything that George Washington said the Jews should enjoy has been revoked by a class of people, a group of people. It's not the majority of Americans. In fact, the popularity of Israel and the Jews right now in America is quite high, and actually has gotten higher in the last 2-3 weeks. But there is a crowd of people who are attacking the Jews. Now, why? It's if the Jews are intertwined with the American idea, it is because it is ultimately an attack on the American idea through the Jews. It isn't really about the Jews. It's about destroying America as the great power of the West, essentially. And you have two camps. One are the progressives. The progressives essentially want and they're the ones who we see on the campuses. They're the ones who are threatening Jewish students, and they are really tied to this larger radical left anti-colonialist sentiment that has positioned the Jews as some colonial entity that are not connected to the ancient Jewish people, are not indigenous. They're just evil interlopers in the land. And that links to what Khaled Abu Tomeh was saying in the erasing of Jewish history, which I would add also the destruction of Jewish archaeological sites, which the Palestinian Authority is engaged in wholesale to try to erase physically the history of the Jewish people. This is all part of the progressive attack, and Jews in America are facing this. And as long as this progressive assault on America is going on, and it is growing and it is becoming more powerful, and unfortunately, American youth are becoming quite enamored with this. This is the threat to both America and the Jewish people. So the old thing, will the Holocaust happen in America? No, but will America survive this progressive threat? And it won't be America that we know, and therefore there could be a Holocaust. That is the question, and that is the question that we're getting from the progressive side. But there's another side too. We're beginning to see now the progressive assault on the Jews is koshering, so to speak. It is making legitimate a truly racist, a truly anti-Semitic attack on the Jewish people. It's making it legitimate again. So now we're beginning to see tones of anti-Semitism. There always were the neo-Nazis. They're in every country. They were in America too. When I grew up, we had these neo-Nazis that tried to march in Skokie, Illinois, in the middle of a neighborhood with a lot of Holocaust survivors. But they were always a very small group of people that were on the margins of American politics, and they were generally considered taboo. There might have been a soft anti-Semitism, Jews not allowed to go to country clubs and things like that, but there wasn't the really terrifying anti-Semitism that you could be physically harmed. Jews were safe. On the far right, that's there, but now on the more moderate right, beginning to mix with this geopolitical view of an increased isolationist crowd, that America has been tricked into these endless wars in the Middle East. Now, who's tricked them? Israel, the Jewish people. You're beginning to see this growing sense that America is engaged in the Middle East and fought these wars in the Middle East and paid a price of 6,000 American soldiers in the Middle East in the last decade and a half, because we were fighting for the Jewish people and for Israel against America's more natural interests, which were none, according to this crowd. So this is beginning to become a very dangerous manifestation of subtle anti-Semitism. It isn't usually overt. They don't usually say, oh, the Jews tricked us. It's usually we are involved in a war that is against our interests, but serves Israel's interests. It's kind of a veiled form of anti-Semitism, but it is, make no mistake, anti-Semitism. So essentially, I think you see growing in the United States an attack on the American idea coming from the right, coming from the left. It's still on the extremes, and it's gripping the youth. Unfortunately, for example, there was a poll 2 weeks ago among people under the age of 24. It's a horrifying poll. Over 60% felt that what Hamas did to Israel was genocide. 63% said that what Hamas did to the Israelis was genocide. But 54% said it was legitimate. In other words, more than half of the children or Americans under the age of 24 thought that genocide was a legitimate act against the Jewish people. So this is a horrifying result. Now, if you go to the other end, older people, it goes 80% for Israel, etc. It's dramatic. And one hopes the youth correct themselves, but we see how this is dangerous and this is growing. Now, part of it, I believe, is also linked that both Dan Diker and Khalid, as well as Yossi, focused on the PLO. I think, yes, of course, Hamas did this. Hamas was awful. This was nothing short of the worst attack on Jews since the Nazis in a day. And it emanates from the same spirit of sadistic cruelty and depravity that Nazism emerged from. But as far as the overall assault on the West and the assault on the Jews and the assault on the American idea by the progressives, I think we have to understand the role that Oslo and the PLO have played in this. That in 1982, after the 1982 war, the PLO was essentially destroyed and exiled to Tunis. And then in 1989, you had the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the progressive world, the world of the radical left, was in great defeat. It didn't have anything to hold on to. It was in a state of chaos, confusion, and facing a calamity of absolute destruction. And only 3-4 years later, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Oslo, the PLO played such a critical role in this radical world of the Red Brigades, the Baader-Meinhof faction, the Red Army faction, and so on and so forth. They were such a central structure upholding this cesspool, this sewage of radical politics that manifested itself in radical terrorism in Europe and the world, Che Guevara and Carlos the Jackal and so forth. When Oslo revived the PLO from death, it essentially provided a Noah's Ark, a vehicle of survival for the PLO. And with it, to some extent, it provided a vehicle of survival for this progressive cesspool, this garbage of anti-Semitism and progressive hatred of Israel, and made it a very central part of the survival and the continuation of the progressive camp. So in many ways, the issue of Israel is not only an attack on the Jews to attack the American idea. It had become the signal issue or the identifying and organizing principle around which progressivism survived from 1993 onward. So I don't think you can disentangle the rise of anti-Semitism from the rehabilitation of the PLO and the Oslo process. So I've gone on long enough. I'll leave it at that. But this, to me, is a battle for the West. This is not a battle for the Jews or for Israel. This is now a battle for the American idea and the world that was created following the revolution in 1776. And it goes back to the words of George Washington. And we are being tested, whether his words stand or whether a new politics will define America where Jews no longer are safe. Thank you.